Hello, everyone. This is Charlie. This is the podcast to Hell and Back. This is September 23rd, 2025. I'm sitting in my office in Northampton, Massachusetts. And I'm wanting to talk to you about something that is complex, a development in myself over time that's not easy to describe. I've wrestled with this. And I think it's mainly be of interest to people in the DBT community rather than a wider group of people, but I'm not sure of that. Um, and gosh, in short, it has to do with it's been prompted by my attempts, as some of you are aware, to apply DBT as a model, not just to clinical work, but to the political situation that we find ourselves in the United States. And it's and over time, I've wrestled with whether this is even appropriate, whether this is helpful, how to do it, and it has emerged as kind of a split within myself that I'm going to try to articulate to you and try to articulate to you the way in which that split has begun to heal, the way I'm finding a synthesis, the way I'm finding that DBT as a model, even though it was not developed to look at political situations, as a way of thinking, has some value to it, as a way of analyzing the situation. So here goes. First, I want to tell you a very central figure for me in coming to terms with these ideas has been my relationship with a man who I first met in medical school at Yale. He was a child psychiatrist uh, while I was a medical student, and I was expected to do a project, um, like a research project, sort of like the Yale Medical School equivalent of doing a dissertation of some kind. And I chose to do it on the experiences of young children and their parents when young children go through a hospitalization, a pediatric hospitalization. And in this case, I chose um, 2.5-year-olds who were hospitalized for surgery to fix a cleft palate. Um, I spent a lot of time as a medical student on the pediatric wards with the Child Life program as a kind of extracurricular activity for myself. I was interested in the experience of children in the hospital and their families as they went through the hospitalizations. I myself, before the age of 3, had several hospitalizations, and though I have no conscious memory of them, I've no doubt that that's what drove me in my career to those kinds of interests. Um, the project I chose was to try to figure out what kind of stresses does it put on a child and a family? What's the exact nature of the problem that they have by going through about a 2-week hospitalization to have a cleft palate fixed? Cleft palate is a difficult thing for a 2.5-year-old to have surgically repaired because it really requires behaving yourself after the surgery. First, you're terrified being in the hospital and you're separated from your parents to a significant degree. And these people in white coats and blue gowns are coming around you and approaching you. And I needn't say more. I think everybody knows that that could be a really difficult situation for a child. Then, in addition, they have to stay very still after the surgery for quite a few days so that they don't disrupt the surgery, which took place in the sort of upper palate of their mouth. Um, I'll spare you a lot of the details here, and just to say that when I did this, and I eventually wrote a dissertation, a thesis called Providing a Constructive Hospitalization for a Young Child and Her Mother. We did two case studies uh, of children that went through the same procedure, the same ward, same nursing staff. Um, and in one case, we just observed naturalistically what happened without intervening. And in the other case, we intervened a lot. We learned from the first case what would be needed to make it a more constructive hospitalization, to preserve the bond with the parents, et cetera, et cetera. But the important thing in this story for today's podcast is that my mentor was this man, the child psychiatrist. His first name's Julian. And so this is 50 years ago for me. And Julian and I worked very closely together on that. And then we continued to be in relationship with each other for, on and off for many years, and including he was at the Yale Child Study Center when I first knew him, and who was the head of what was called the Child Development Unit, which was to oversee the care of children that were between, I think, ages 0 and 3 or 0 and 5. Um, and he introduced me to other people there and other experiences at the Yale Child Study Center. So over the years, we've stayed in contact, and in the last few years, we've had more contact again with each other. As he has retired, he still lives in New Haven, but also has a house in Vermont. He and his wife, who is a pediatrician. But he retired several years ago, and what he spends his days doing, now into his 80s, is he's been working for years with another psychologist, another man, a psychologist that he's known for his whole career, on understanding the what has happened to um, individuals in the Republican Party who have become MAGA, um, and who have gone in a direction that might have been hard to predict many years ago, and many of whom have, are very decent, moral um, people in their lives, except in the political aspect of their lives, where they seem to have lost their way in terms of morals and values, and can be supportive of a regime that's rather corrupt and harsh, authoritarian, and moving us, if possible, towards a fascist coup. So he's been wanting to understand the underpinning psychologically. What is this that has happened? And he and I have had conversation after conversation. I go to Vermont every month or two, and we hang out, we have dinner, and we talk sometimes for hours, including about these things, what has happened politically and how to understand it, as well as the other personal things that we share about our lives. So I've continued, and Julian has listened to several of my podcasts that maybe some of you have listened to, trying to address the political developments over the last many months, and even years ago during the first Trump administration, I did some. Um, and and what has challenged me, and what's part of this podcast, is the perspective that Julian has, and the perspective that I have, that's at least partially rooted in DBT, and especially the podcasts that I do that are rooted in DBT. And so I'll just get us going by reading to you a text he recently wrote me, or it was about a month ago. Um, and I just let me pull it up in front of me here for a second. Hmm. Okay. So here's what Julian wrote me, and this is one of many things I could say that captures this dilemma for me. He writes, and I quote, "I admire your choices to help resist the fascist coup. I've been somewhat of an activist in some areas, as many of us have. The Harvard Alumni Ad Hoc Committee. I've been part of a group at Harvard trying to be activist in response to the administration's attempts to uh, restrict Harvard and change its practices, and the podcast. You are obviously a decent, smart, and reasonable person. You are a good public speaker and teacher. The approach you take is practical, pragmatic, behavioral, and very useful for some people at some times. You know your audience, and it may help lots of them. I hope so. You frame DBT as anchored in the decision to want to live or not. Perhaps you could do better to frame this behavioral political work at a deeper moral and motivational level. Okay. So Julian wrote that about a month ago, and I've been thinking before that, during that, and after that, both in the foreground and background of my mind. I don't think about it all the time, but it just keeps coming back to mind. Why? Not just because I really value Julian and his points of view about things, but I think he's right in some way about this, about how my thinking, my explanation of the political situation through the lens of a DBT model um, is lacking something. And I don't know whether this applies only to me or whether this is a broader thing for people who are doing behavioral work in general and DBT in particular. So if the shoe fits, wear it. But it's possible that this is something that is somewhat unique to me. And one of the reasons for that could be, if it's true, that there's kind of a split in me that I've had to be attempting to navigate through my entire career as a psychiatrist because I did psychoanalytic training when I was back in New Haven, Connecticut, and that was my first language in psychotherapy. And I was fascinated by it. I loved it. Actually, I just pulled a book off the shelf called The Language of Psychoanalysis, which is a kind of a dictionary of psychoanalytic terminology that during my psychoanalytic training I used many times, but just to hold up the other book, Cognitive Behavioral Therapy, of a treatment of borderline personality disorder. Here's the DBT book. So here's the two sides, the psychoanalytic side and the behavioral DBT side of my professional career as a psychotherapist and a teacher. Um, I've really valued both sides, and they occupy different spaces in me, you might say, different frames of reference. And I do sometimes go back and forth between them. I sometimes run into a dead end trying to treat somebody with NDBT, and I find my mind reaching back into certain psychoanalytic concepts and ideas about intrapsychic structure that then help me move forward. And in fact, if I do something that's more of a psychodynamic therapy, I sometimes encounter a particular stubborn situation where I can bring DBT skills or strategies to bear. So there's been this kind of split in me that I think lays the ground for the split here that I have in trying to come to terms with the immensity of the attack on our democratic system with the behaviorally specific model of DBT. So I've been trying to put these things together. I'm just saying that I think that I might be vulnerable to trying to reconcile these things if this isn't more broadly felt by other DBT therapists. Um, so the question is, for those of us who ground a lot of our thinking about humans and psychology in a DBT model, how do we apply it to the profound assault on our democracy, on our Constitution, on our usual norms and values by those who seem so corrupt, so harsh, and so damning of those living on the margins of society, those already suffering? And so everything from this moment forward in this podcast is about my effort to put this together. Um, so let me just say first, how is it that one could even make an argument that DBT might limit us in our thinking and our action in response to the dramatic and rapid takeover of our country by such dark forces that are sort of, from my point of view, on the face of it, obviously corrupt, self-centered, self-enriching, harsh, immoral, and antithetical to democracy. Uh, um, of course, one argument, and it's sort of obvious, DBT wasn't designed to be a political philosophy. DBT is a treatment model. So why would you even think of applying it? And that's a perfectly good question. I mean, I think of applying it just because I've been thinking in DBT terms about therapy as well as many other things for the past 35 years. So it's natural for me to bring DBT as a thinking model. It also has been helpful to me, not just in therapy, but in my family life and in my personal life. So, but here's some thoughts. DBT is grounded in non-judgmental observation and in behavioral description of phenomena, trying to leave aside judgment and editorializing, just the facts, just the facts as the truth. DBT's mindfulness skills, for instance, there's 6 mindfulness skills, but especially the skills of observing and describing and participating are all avenues to grasping factual reality, to finding the truth of the present moment, facts. The other 3 mindfulness skills, by the way, non-judgmental, one mindful, and effective, are you might think of as antidotes to those factors that interfere with perceiving objective reality with the first 3 skills. You know what I mean? Like non-judgmental helps to address judgments, and judgments blur and cloud a factual understanding of things. One mindful is a skill that helps remind us to stay in the moment with one thing at a time, rather than have our judgment and our thinking and our perception of reality clouded by multitasking all the time. Um, but by grounding ourselves to a behavioral description as it flows along, which is kind of how we think most of the time in DBT, such as in behavioral chain analysis, we might be predisposed, I think I've been predisposed to miss some of the deeper and broader trends that Julian is alluding to, including deep motivations and deep intentions. Like, for instance, if someone showed up, I mentioned this in one previous podcast, if somebody shows up at our front door at our house with a gun, threatening to kill us, kill our family, take our stuff, and move on and do the same thing to all of our neighbors, we would hardly respond primarily to the behavioral descriptive flow with observing and describing and participating in what's going on. We would respond instead to the threat to our lives, our families, our neighbors, and our ways of life. And this is more the parallel of what I think is happening. It doesn't quite feel like it because most of us are not having people show up at our door, though some people in America are. Um, but it's coming to that kind of frightening collision with authoritarian reality. Um, so one thing is we're sort of anchored in behavioral description, specific behavioral description, which might obscure our broader grasp of the depth and breadth of some of the trends that are going on. Secondly, DBT obviously emphasizes validation as a very important and centering strategy, even when we can't see the validity in some behavioral pattern, we search for it. like trying to find, as Marsha Linehan put it, a nugget of gold in a cup of sand. And while this is a valuable and effective strategy for doing therapy, um, and elsewhere in our lives, most of the time, what if there are times that that nugget of gold, if there is one, is embedded in and is overwhelmed by the sand around it, which might be poisonous? Um, we wouldn't search through the sand looking for the nugget of gold, looking for the um, validity buried in that sand. If the sand is poison, we might need to dispose of the sand or somehow figure out a way to cope with it, knowing that there might be validity in it, validity behind it, but that actually the force of it is so destructive and to our life goals and our lives that we can't just busy ourselves with finding the validity. Third thing about DBT. Remember, the first thing is the behavioral specificity. The second thing is the emphasis on validity and validation. The third is the emphasis on dialectical thinking. Um, this is incredibly helpful for addressing polarization and dead ends in treatment, as all DBT therapists know, and in areas of life. Um, but there may be times when searching for the validity, the wisdom, and the truth on both sides of a conflict is made futile when one of those sides is determined to destroy the other side and is taking action to destroy the other side. It doesn't mean that there isn't validity in both sides, but it might render the search for validity to be pointless or even counterproductive and self-destructive rather than healthy. So the fact that our search for behavioral specificity, for validation, and for dialectical thinking could lead us to miss a bigger picture in some situations is not in itself an indictment of DBT as a model, since DBT wasn't intended as a political philosophy. It speaks instead, maybe, at least from my perspective, to a narrower application of DBT's foundational principles than we need to do. So let's consider those principles. What am I talking about? Well, first, think about what gave rise to DBT. What is the ultimate function of DBT in the world, if you want to put it that way? The meaning and the function. It arose in the 1970s and 80s in response to the choice between life and death that some people face in response to their suffering. It's a response to suffering. It's a response to dysregulation. It's a response sometimes to an environment that is invalidating, and it is a response to being in some version of hell. Marsha Linehan framed it not as a method to prevent suicide. It's a very interesting, very important aspect of DBT, is that it isn't meant, even though it is a suicide prevention practice, it's not a practice driven primarily by the goal to prevent suicide. Instead, she framed it as a model, the ultimate aim of which, for each individual, and by extension for a family, for a community, and for society as a whole, to build a life worth living. The ultimate aim in DBT is to build a life worth living. When Linehan was asked whether she would help someone determine whether they should live or die, which she was asked several times over the course of her career with all the suicidal people she worked with, she responded again and again by saying that she did not have the wisdom to help with that decision. She would tell people she was always on the side of life. She was always on the side of building a life that, because it was worth living, suicide, or correspondingly homicide, would fade from one's repertoire, from necessity. So we could say that DBT has at its core a profoundly moral position. It's a model of thinking and acting based on building lives worth living, getting everyone out of hell, an essentially compassionate point of view about people that is then hammered out in its theory, in its assumptions, and in the agreements that people make in entering into DBT. So let's take a look at some of those agreements because when Marsha Linehan first came out to my program that I had developed with my staff in New York, um, my DBT program that I began to build during the late 1980s. And it was the first real established DBT program outside of Marsha Linehan's laboratory at the Department of Psychology in Washington. And it was an inpatient unit where we tried to apply DBT throughout the unit in every way we could think of um, to the treatment of our patients. Marcia came and spent about 3 months with us when she was on sabbatical. And the first question she asked me and my staff was, have you and your staff discussed, debated, and signed on to the 6 DBT team agreements? There's 6 consultation team agreements in DBT. And for Marcia, those were kind of the constitution of DBT. And if you're going to enter into doing DBT, you want to examine those 6 agreements and see if you can live within them, or if you can't, and debate them and discuss them and figure out what to do about it. So what do we find in those agreements? For those of you in the DBT world, you know what these 6 agreements are. So I hope this doesn't bore you, but I want to apply just to highlight how it is that these agreements form a kind of a moral foundation, a deep moral foundation in DBT that you might not feel every minute you're practicing with behavioral specificity, but it's there. It is the foundation upon which you stand. So the dialectical agreement in Linehan's first manual, just to quote her for a moment about it, she says, there is no absolute truth. I mean, think about this in relation to a more authoritarian point of view, a more dogmatic point of view, a more rigid absolutist point of view. There is no absolute truth. Therefore, when polarities arise, the task is to search for the synthesis rather than for the truth. The dialectical agreement does not proscribe strong opinions, nor does it suggest that polarities are undesirable. Rather, it simply points to the direction therapists agree to take when passionately held polar positions threaten to split the consultation team. End of quote. So essentially, this says that no one person, no subgroup of people, no leader, no matter what their level of power or experience is, has a monopoly on the truth in DBT. We are grappling, all of us, so to speak, to find balance and cooperation, synthesis among the differing parties, which from my perspective is very consistent with the spirit and at times the chaotic experience of finding our way forward in democracy. So first, the dialectical agreement. Second, the consultation to the patient agreement. The spirit of this agreement is that therapists don't do for their patients as much as to help patients acquire abilities to do for themselves. It is a way of lifting people up, um, and not doing for them, which can sort of help to disable people unless they absolutely need you to do for them, in which case it's fine. It's kind of a clause under the consultation to the patient agreement. And it's a little bit like the spirit of where a rising tide lifts all boats sort of agreement, in that our goal is to lift up everyone, not lift up some at the expense of others. Another profoundly moral agreement that's very consistent with the principles of equality under the law, and everyone's right to pursue life, liberty, and happiness. The third agreement, the consistency agreement. We need not all be consistent. The consistency agreement, for maybe DBT people mostly know this, but you could equally call it the inconsistency agreement because it really says that we don't all have to be consistent with one another in what we teach and how we respond. I mean, the basic principles, yes, we follow the basic principles and the basic outlines of DBT, but each therapist can make up his or her own rules about the actual conditions of therapy with himself or herself. It could make for conflict sometimes and mix-ups, but these are viewed as inevitable in DBT as they are inevitable in life. And there's uh, with respect to the political situation, the consistency agreement has within it a kind of valuation on nonconformity, rather than everybody having to conform and do the same thing in the same way, which again is kind of consistent with a kind of what has been uh, at least the ideal of the American way, the democratic way. Um, the next agreement, observing limits agreement. The spirit of this agreement emphasizes that each individual is responsible for determining and managing their own personal limits. They are not responsible for determining and dictating the limits that others around them must conform to. Um, this is like you're responsible for yourself. You're responsible for defining what you can tolerate, what you can't tolerate. But your job is not to go around and dictate to other people what they should do, what they shouldn't do, and how they can conform. Other than there being sort of limits of the law that everybody has to pay attention to. Um, but this is a profoundly anti-authoritarian agreement. Um, Next one, phenomenological empathy agreement. It's a mouthful. This is the agreement to search for non-pejorative, empathic interpretations of the behavior of other people. And it's based on the assumption that patients are trying their best and that they want to improve, regardless of how it looks. This is kind of consistent with the idea of do unto others as you would have others do unto you. It's really get inside the shoes of another person and understand what matters to them in helping them reduce suffering, helping them build a better life. This agreement promotes caring, it promotes compassion, understanding each other, and building everyone up rather than tearing people down. And the sixth agreement, the last agreement, is the fallibility agreement. I say the last agreement, but I cannot tell you, when I go around the world teaching DBT, um, everywhere I go, people say, no, there's a seventh agreement. No, there's an eighth and a ninth agreement. There's lots of other possible agreements, but at least by Linehan's manual, there are these six agreements. So you certainly could add some others. The fallibility agreement is the sixth one. All therapists are fallible. The way Linehan would put that is all therapists are jerks. If they're called jerks by a client, they probably are jerks in some way. All therapists are fallible. The spirit of this agreement holds that each person makes mistakes. Each person is responsible for staying within the protocols and the other agreements of DBT. And this agreement helps to counter any tendency toward thinking that any one of us is perfect, that any one of us is infallible, that any one of us is really better than others of us. It could be called the humility agreement. So those are the six agreements. So let me say something else about the origins of DBT. It was developed out of respect for behavioral science, respect for behavioral principles. It's based in some ways on religious morality. By that I mean moral principles that come from a range of religions, but without allegiance to any one particular religion or God, or even a God. But very much like cooperation, compassion, do unto others as you would have others do unto you, and out of respect for life, of oneself and others. So I guess the point I'm making over and over again in different ways with these different agreements and these different origins of DBT is that it has a profoundly moral basis, a deep moral basis, if you want to apply it to anything beyond treatment itself. So how is it that we deal with our emphasis on finding validity in everything? This other thing I said earlier, because really when you are trying to find validity in a force that is trying to destroy your life, or at least that's what you think. You're trying to find validity. You can find validity. Philosophically, you can find where it came from, the history of where it came from, um, the philosophy that it came from. You can find ingredients of validity there, I'm sure. And I have done that. Many of you have done that. Um, but but when one side is so forcefully and obviously threatening to destroy the way of life, and the other side, and is polarizing things so dramatically, um, here's what I've come to about this idea of being validating and finding validity. There is kind of a loophole within DBT, a big one, that really helps to answer this. Marsha Linehan, I did some training with her in 1994. It was actually the first intensive she did with someone else. She did with me. And I can't say that I did as much teaching as her because I was still kind of learning the ropes. But I had the privilege of getting to teach with her. During that 1994 intensive, I can't tell you how many hours she was spending struggling with the ideas of validation. She had published her manual in 1993, and the one chapter of her manual that she now wanted to revise was on validation and validation strategies. And in fact, she then went on to write an article that I think was published in 1997 on validation, which was kind of an update. And this was one of the parts of validation that she wrestled with. One of the things she did during in that article was to update people about validation by defining 6 levels of validation. Um, but that isn't the part I'm talking about. There's another part uh, where she clarified that in treatment, we validate the valid and we invalidate the invalid. In other words, we don't try to find the validation in everything, the validity in everything. Um, and I had dialogues with her at the time saying, but Marcia, how can there be anything that's invalid? I mean, from a philosophical point of view, she had listed at least 5 different ways that you can establish the validity of a given behavior. And then she also specified that you can find the behavior's validity by looking at its past, like how did it come to be, and therefore it's valid. Looking at the future in the mind of the person who's doing the behavior, because maybe it doesn't look valid in the moment, but if you understand what they're aiming for in their future, maybe it'll you'll understand the validity of their behavior. And there's the validity of the present moment. Like, of course, you're doing that. That's what many people would do in response to your circumstances. So there's all kinds of ways. There's at least 8 or 9 different ways to establish validity. And I said, you could establish validity of murder. You could establish validity of suicide. You could establish all these things. And so when she talked about not wanting to validate the invalid, she then clarified for me what she meant. And this is really going back to this is really what's been helpful to me about just reconciling my sort of stances within DBT with a profoundly moral stance. Um, be, what she explained was that the ultimate aim of DBT is to help each individual build a life worth living. And the goals that you hammer out in each case with each patient are the goals to help them get to the life worth living, right? And the targets that we aim for in treatment are the targets to fulfill those goals. So by aiming for the targets, we're aiming for the goals, and ultimately we're aiming to build a life worth living. Um, and that defines so much of what we're doing in DBT. So what is invalid, she said, what she meant by invalid was, in a sense, clinically invalid, in that those are the factors that will block the way or counter the momentum toward those goals, toward those targets, and toward that definition of a life worth living. So, for instance, when someone wants to build a life of relationships and activities that bring meaning and satisfaction, attempts at suicide are, by that definition, invalid. Now, the emotion of wanting to die might be valid. The thoughts of wanting to die might be valid. The history behind wanting to die might be valid, would be valid. But the actual act itself of suicide, she would not want to validate the act of suicide. She wouldn't want to say, oh, of course you want to die, or of course you're going to kill yourself. Absolutely. She thought that really goes directly against what you're trying to do. So you want to be a little careful about validating the act of suicide. Similarly, with other problematic behaviors in DBT, like self-harm behaviors or relapses into addictions. You don't want to validate using drugs again, but you can validate all of the antecedent factors that lead you to want to use drugs again, or attacking other human beings with violence would be considered invalid. So while these things all might be philosophically valid, they are, you might say, like I said, clinically invalid. And when Linehan treated patients, it was very noticeable. And watching videotapes of her, you could see that she would validate step after step in a chain of behaviors leading up to a seriously problematic act. But when it got to the seriously problematic act, one of the invalid behaviors, she would decisively invalidate it by saying something like, so I could see why you got in that situation. I can see why you felt that way, blah, blah, blah. But you know what? Never, ever do it again. Don't go down that road. That road is paving the way to hell for you. So just stop it. And so she would shift from having a very validating style to being very decisive about stopping it, which she considered to be that, and she called that invalidating the invalid. And since dialectics as a practice includes the effort to find the validity on both sides of an argument and then find the synthesis between them, it's based on validating both sides. The same limit would apply here. You don't necessarily validate everything on both sides. You might validate what's valid, but invalidate what's invalid. And I think when something is forcefully working towards destroying your life and what makes your life worth living, and for some people even makes them be able to have a life, that it becomes forceful enough that you'd consider that the invalid and you would invalidate it, which means you would decisively denounce it. You would decisively, if necessary, take action against it. That person that showed up on your doorstep at your house with a gun saying they're going to kill you and your family, you would somehow decisively, if you could find a way, you would stop them. you would take it out. And I think that's the position that from a DBT perspective, that from a political point of view, if people are destroying what makes life worth living, then it's an attack on your foundations, and you would stop it and be activist in that way. So, in conclusion, I think this helps me personally find my way in reconciling my heavy use of DBT in my life, especially in treatment, but in some areas outside of treatment, and using it as a model for dealing with other human beings that actually is, while potentially somewhat narrow, it's also profoundly moral. It's consistent with my values. And I don't think it's diminished or limited by a narrow focus on behavioral specificity and a narrow focus on the strategies of validation and dialectics in treatment, especially when you consider the extreme importance of invalidating the invalid as it takes shape in front of you. So I hope this was interesting to you if you managed to listen to the whole thing. I would love to hear from you. Any dialogue about this is very meaningful to me. So you could write me at my email address, c.robert.swenson@gmail.com, or go to my website and you can send an email through my website to me, or leave a comment wherever you listen to a podcast like this. Okay? Okay, ciao, adios. Thank you for listening, and I'll talk to you in the future. Bye.